There's a pattern most people don't notice until much later in life. Most people believe they're constantly being watched. Few people see the pattern behind attention. Every awkward moment feels unforgettable. Every mistake feels public. Every embarrassing memory feels permanent, as though the world is quietly keeping score. But the strange part is, most people are doing exactly the same thing, not watching you, watching themselves. A conversation ends, and you spend hours wondering if you said the wrong thing, whether you sounded foolish, whether they judged you. Meanwhile, the other person is driving home replaying something they said, not yours, theirs. One of the strongest psychological illusions is believing other people think about us as much as we think about ourselves, but they don't, because every mind is already occupied with its own fears, its own future, its own regrets, its own unfinished conversations. Think about yesterday. How many strangers can you remember seeing? Probably very few. Not because they weren't there, because your attention was somewhere else. Now reverse the pattern. You're one of those strangers in someone else's mind. This realization feels uncomfortable at first, because most people secretly want to matter, to be remembered, to be noticed. But hidden inside that discomfort is something unexpected: freedom. The mind creates an invisible audience. It imagines people constantly evaluating us, judging us, comparing us, remembering every mistake. But psychology reveals something very different. People rarely observe us with that level of attention because they're carrying the same invisible audience inside their own minds. Every person believes they're standing under the spotlight, which means almost nobody is actually looking at anyone else. And that's where another pattern appears. The prison was never other people's opinions. The prison was believing they were thinking about you in the first place. The strange part is this: the less you believe people are watching, the more honestly you begin living. Because you're no longer performing. You're no longer editing every sentence before you speak. You're no longer asking invisible people for permission to become yourself. Think about how many decisions are quietly controlled by imagined judgment. The clothes you don't wear, the idea you never shared, the opportunity you never accepted, the conversation you never started, not because someone stopped you, because you believed someone might. There's a psychological pattern behind this. The brain constantly overestimates how much attention other people give us. Psychologists call it the spotlight effect. Your mind assumes a spotlight follows you everywhere, but in reality, almost everyone is standing beneath their own. Imagine walking through a crowded city at night. Every window is illuminated. From outside, it feels like the entire city can see you. But inside each building, someone is worrying about tomorrow. Someone is replaying an argument. Someone is wondering whether they're good enough. Someone is questioning a decision they made years ago. Very few are looking out the window. And that's why something remarkable happens. The moment you stop trying to control other people's opinions, you begin controlling your own life. Not because the world changed, because your attention changed. Another pattern slowly becomes visible. People spend years seeking validation, waiting for someone to finally notice them, finally approve, finally understand. But validation is unstable because it depends on minds you cannot control. Awareness is different. Awareness belongs to you. The moment your happiness depends less on being noticed, it depends more on becoming aligned. Aligned with your values, your curiosity, your direction, not someone else's expectations. That's why the freest people often appear surprisingly calm, not because life became easier, because they stopped carrying an invisible audience everywhere they went. And the weight they lost was never physical, it was psychological. The question changes. Instead of asking, "What will people think?" you begin asking, "What do I actually think?" And those two questions lead to completely different lives. And then another pattern quietly reveals itself. The people who seem the most authentic are rarely the people who receive the most approval. They're the people who stopped needing it. Most people spend years trying to become acceptable. Acceptable to strangers, acceptable to family, acceptable to society. But acceptance is a moving target. Every person measures it differently, so chasing it never really ends. The mind begins negotiating with invisible judges. I'll say this,
but not that. I'll wear this, but not that. I'll become this version of myself, as long as nobody disapproves. Slowly, a life is built around avoiding rejection instead of pursuing meaning. And that's where another hidden cost appears. Every decision made to avoid judgment is a decision no longer guided by your own direction. Without realizing it, you begin living someone else's expectations instead of your own life. The strange part is, most of those expectations never actually existed. They were assumptions, imagined conversations, predicted criticism, stories the mind created before reality had the chance to be. Think back to the moments that changed your life, the opportunity you accepted, the risk you finally took, the conversation you finally had, the version of yourself you eventually became. How many of those moments happened after you stopped worrying about everyone watching? Because courage isn't the absence of fear. Sometimes it's the realization that the audience you feared was never really paying attention. Every person eventually discovers this in their own way. Some discover it after failure, some after heartbreak, some after losing years trying to impress people who barely remembered yesterday, and some discover it simply by paying attention to the pattern. The pattern has always been there. Every mind is carrying its own worries, its own insecurities, its own unfinished story, which leaves very little attention for yours. Not because people are cruel, because they're human. And strangely, that isn't depressing, it's liberating. Because if people aren't constantly watching, you're free to begin again, free to make mistakes, free to change your mind, free to become someone entirely different without asking permission. The goal was never to make everyone remember you. The goal was to stop forgetting yourself. Because the moment you stop performing for invisible audiences, you begin living for visible purpose. Most people spend their lives searching for approval. Few people recognize that freedom begins the moment approval is no longer required. Because the world was never holding you back, the invisible audience was. And once you see the pattern, you stop living inside imagined expectations. You start living inside your own reality. And once you see the pattern, you can change the outcome.